The morning of the Wexmoor autumn hunt, the air had smelled of frost and turned bracken, and Georgiana Vane had stood at the edge of the stubble field, with her hands loose at her sides, and her face arranged the way she had arranged it since childhood. Composed, attentive, giving nothing away. The field had been full of men in fitted coats and polished boots, and their wives had clustered at the far edge of the hedgerow under their good mantles, and 30 people had heard what Edmund said. She had not moved. She had stood very still in the cold, and let the words settle over her the way frost settles. And she had not looked at him. And she had not wept. And she had heard the laughter that followed, brief and male and self-satisfied. And she had understood with a clarity that surprised her. Carefully beginning to believe, she had thought he was beginning to see her. She saw now that she had been mistaken. That was the first morning of the hunt. This is the story of the second. The season had not been kind to the name of Vane since that October morning, and the county had a long memory and a comfortable winter in which to exercise it. Gossip in the great houses of the West Country moved the way damp moves through stone, slowly and thoroughly, until it had reached every room. By December, Georgiana could not attend a dinner without catching the pause that preceded her introduction, the fractional readjustment of expression, the calibrated warmth that was offered in place of genuine welcome. She had learned to receive it graciously. She had learned a great many things in the 11 months of her marriage to Edmund Alderton Vane, Earl of Wexmoor, and chief among them was the particular loneliness of living inside a house that was not yet, and might never become, a home. They had married in the spring of the previous year following a compact between families of long acquaintance and a single season of proximity, during which Edmund had been precisely, methodically courteous to her in the way of a man discharging a debt. He was 33, 12 years her senior, and he carried his title the way the old Wexmoor house carried its history, with a kind of gravity that suggested the weight had become so familiar it no longer registered as weight. He was not unkind to her. He was not warm. He occupied the same rooms she occupied, attended the same dinners, escorted her correctly through the ceremonies the county required of them, and remained as opaque to her understanding as the portrait of his dead father that hung at the turn of the library stair. She had arrived at Wexmoor with 3 trunks, a modest dowry that her father had managed to put aside from the long work of a middling estate in Somerset, and her father's old fowling piece which she had not mentioned to Edmund's staff, and which now lived in the corner of the gun-room behind a rack of his matched mantons. It was a plain gun, serviceable rather than elegant, the stock worn to a particular smoothness at the grip from 30 years of use. She had carried it herself from the carriage, and placed it quietly, where it would not be noticed. And not one member of the Wexmoor household had remarked upon it, because it was the kind of thing that was easy to overlook, if one was already disposed to overlook the woman who had brought it. Her father had taught her to shoot on the same West Country hills where he had raised cattle and managed hedgerows, and understood the land the way people understand languages they were born to. She had grown up with the smell of black powder in her hair and the specific pleasure of a clean, well-judged shot, and she had not offered this knowledge to anyone at Wexmoor, because she had understood from the first that the hunting set Edmund inhabited did not want its women to be capable. It wanted them to be decorative and approving, and not too particular about rain. Lord Bertram Carow had been at the breakfast table the morning before the first hunt. He was Edmund's nearest neighbor, a man of considerable sporting reputation and equally considerable self-satisfaction, and he had said, without lowering his voice, that Wexmoor's wife would slow the morning. "She's no shot, I'd wager," he said, and he said it pleasantly, in the tone of a man offering an observation rather than an insult, which made it worse. Edmund had not corrected him. She did not hold this against Edmund, not precisely. She held it in the careful interior space where she held all the things she could not yet name, and she attended the hunt because she had been invited, and because she was the Countess of Wexmoor and the county expected her presence. And she stood in the field with the other wives. And she said nothing when the men raised their guns, and she said nothing when Lord Carrow's dog quartered the field, and she held herself still and attentive and invisible, which was what the morning required of her. And then Edmund, in the company of 4 men whose opinion he valued more than she had understood, had said what he said. It was a sentence of 10 words. It concerned her aim. It was light, throwaway, self-deprecating in its construction. He had framed it as a jest about the quality of instruction she had received, as though her deficiency were charming, as though she were a child who had not yet grasped that grown people were watching. The field had laughed. Edmund had smiled, and Georgiana had stood in the cold with her face arranged and her hands loose, and she had felt something close inside her chest, quietly, like a room whose door has been shut for the last time. If you have ever stood in a field and heard someone you were beginning to love say something they could not take back, then you do not need the scene described to you at length. You know the specific weight of it. The second autumn came with its early chill, and with it the announcement of the Wexmore hunt. The same company, the same field, the same cold breakfast laid out in the great hall. Edmund had proposed that she join the field this year. He said it without looking at her. She had not been able to determine whether this constituted amends or something more complicated, and she had said yes, because she was the Countess of Wexmore, and the county expected her, and because somewhere in the careful interior space she kept for things she could not name. She was not yet finished with him. Lady Sylvia Carow had been at the Hunt Ball the prior December. She was Bertram's wife, and the self-appointed social custodian of the county's sporting set, a woman of considerable beauty and very precise social intelligence, who had spent 15 years constructing a reputation for elegant frankness that permitted her to say wounding things. She had come to Georgiana at the ball with both hands extended, and a smile that had not quite reached her eyes, and she had said, in the warm tone of someone expressing sympathy, that Georgiana must find it dreadful being so out of her element among sporting people. "Poor dear," she had said, and the 2 words had carried the full measure of what they were meant to carry, and Lady Carow had moved on, and the circle of women around them had rearranged itself carefully, and Georgiana had stood with her glass of ratafia and her arranged face and had thought, with a precision, that she could see the target and she was learning the distance. She did not subscribe to the belief that patience was a passive quality. It was not. Patience required constant interior effort, the daily choosing not to respond, not to recoil, not to make smaller the space one occupied in a world that was trying to reduce it. She had been patient at Wexmore for 11 months, and she had been quietly, methodically taking stock of the house and its people, and the shape of the life she had been placed inside, and she had arrived at a kind of knowledge that felt less like comfort than like a map of difficult terrain. Clear, and specific and useful, precisely because it made no promises. She knew the east pasture in all weathers. She knew which tenant held the lower field, and which of his children had been ill last winter. She knew which servants could be trusted with the linen accounts, and which required closer supervision. And she had managed all of it without fanfare, because management without fanfare was simply how work was done. The county had decided not to notice any of this. She had noticed that the county had decided not to notice, and she had continued doing the work. Edmund was not a cruel man. She had decided this in the first weeks of the marriage and had not revised it. He was a man who had been formed by something that had made him cold, or who had chosen coldness as a protection against something, and he had not yet found his way to the cost of that choice. She could not make him find it. She could only be what she was, clearly and without apology, and see whether the distance between them was one that could be crossed. The hunt morning arrived, with a low mist on the pasture, and the particular blue light of a late October dawn, and Georgiana rose before the household stirred. She dressed plainly in the dark, and went down the back passage to the gun room, and she found her father's fowling piece behind the mantons in its canvas case, and she carried it out through the kitchen garden and across the ha-ha to the long fence line where the east pasture met the stand of oaks. In the gray light before sunrise, she set a row of clay targets along the fence post tops at intervals she judged appropriate, and she loaded with the careful, unhurried practice of a woman who had done this since she was 12 years old, and she began to shoot. The gun was lighter than Edmund's field pieces and older, and it fit her shoulder the way things fit when they have been fitted by long use. She was not performing for anyone. She was not proving anything. She was doing the thing her father had taught her to do when she was afraid or angry or uncertain. The thing that required complete attention to the present moment, to the line of the gun, to the breath released at the exact correct instant. She worked through the row of targets in the early morning quiet, and the sound of each shot carried across. The frost and the oak branches above her held still. She did not hear Edmund come to the tree line. He had spent the night in the library. He had not gone to bed because the library was the room in the house where he thought most clearly, or rather most honestly, which was a distinction he had only recently begun to understand. He had sat in the leather chair by the cold grate, and he had looked at the thing on the wall that he never looked at directly. And he had arrived, in the long hours between midnight and the gray pre-dawn, at the beginning of an understanding he did not yet have language for. The portrait of his mother, Helena Vane, hung above the library's west-facing chimney-piece. She had died when Edmund was 11. He did not remember her clearly. What he remembered was the way the house had changed after her death, the specific quality of the silence his father had cultivated in her absence. The portrait turned to face the wall when Edmund was 16, because the old Earl had said he could not bear to look at it anymore, and then had never given the instruction to turn it back. Edmund had left it turned. He had not examined why until this past year had forced him to examine a great many things he had left in the positions he had inherited. His father had told him something, the winter before he died. Edmund had been home for the funeral of a tenant, not for sentiment, and the old Earl had been in his last season, and had been for once unlocked by illness into something close to candor. He had said that he had made one good thing in his long life, and it had been the woman he married, and he had never once told anyone so, because the men of his set had mocked him for loving her, and he had chosen to let them think he did not, and this had been the greatest error of his years, and he was asking Edmund not to make it also. Edmund had heard weakness. He had heard it so clearly and so completely that he had not been able to hear anything else. He had gone to the window in the pre-dawn to stand with his tea cooling in his hand, thinking about the shape of what he was about to lose, and he had seen a figure cross the ha-ha and walk out into the east pasture with something over her shoulder. And without forming an intention, he had gone out through the kitchen door and across the garden and to the edge of the oaks, and he had stood in the shadow of the tree line and watched his wife shoot the steadiness of her. That was the thing he could not stop watching. Not the accuracy of her aim, though the accuracy was unmistakable, but the quality of attention she brought to it, the complete and unhurried focus of a woman who was entirely, competently herself. Paff. She worked through the row of targets with the practiced ease of long training, and the gun fit her the way it fit someone who had grown up with it in her hands, and she hit each one cleanly, and between shots she stood with a stillness that the cold morning seemed to gather around. He had lived beside her for 11 months and eaten his meals in her company, and slept in the rooms next to hers, and he had not known that she could do this. He had not looked. The distinction settled over him in the early morning light with the specific weight of a thing one has been avoiding. He had not looked at her. He had seen what the marriage required him to see: the household arrangements, the correct conduct, the season's obligations, and he had filed what he saw in the category his father's house had given him for wives, which was the category of arrangement rather than the category of person, and he had left her there, and she had been here in his east pasture at first light, doing what she had always known how to do, without asking his permission, and without seeking his attention, simply being what she was. He thought, standing in the shadow of the oaks, of the many mornings she had come down to breakfast before him and had the household's affairs already in hand by the time he arrived. He thought of the evening in August when one of the tenant children had cut his hand on a sickle blade, and Georgiana had been the one to find the boy, and he had come upon her in the estate kitchen with the child on her lap, and his hand wrapped in clean linen, and her voice steady as she told him a story about her father's horses. Keeping his attention away from the pain, he had stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before she saw him, and he had noted it and categorized it and moved on. He thought now about that doorway. He thought about how many doorways he had stood in, and what he had done with what he saw. He stood at the tree line for a long time. After she had finished, he did not go to her. He did not have the right to go to her yet. He had a great deal of work to do before he would have that right, and the first of it was the thing he had been avoiding since October of the previous year. If something in your chest has been waiting for a man to see clearly, and he finally begins to see, there is a specific quality to the silence that follows. It does not feel like triumph. It feels like the ground steadying. The house was dark and full of the sounds of a sleeping hunting party when Georgiana came in from the east pasture. She put the fowling piece back in its case, and she went up the back stairs, and she passed the library door, and she saw the light, and she went in, because she had learned in 11 months that she would not find Edmund by waiting in the rooms where she was supposed to wait. He was in the leather chair by the cold grate, and the portrait above the chimney-piece was still turned to face the wall, and he looked up when she came in with an expression she had not seen on him before. She stood in the doorway with the smell of frost and powder still on her coat, and she looked at him, and he said her name. Georgiana, he said, not Lady Wexmore. Not a form of address that kept the appropriate distance intact. Her name, in a voice she had not heard him use, as though the word required something of him that other words did not. She came into the room. But she sat in the chair, across from him, not because she was invited, but because she was the Countess of Wexmore, and this was her library, and she had waited long enough to sit down when she needed to. She looked at the portrait, turned to face the wall. And then she looked at him, and she waited. He told her about his father. Not in a speech. In pieces, in the low, plain way of a man who has had to dismantle something he built badly, in order to say what is true. He told her about the deathbed and the words he had heard wrong and the year he had spent trying to understand what he had missed. He told her with a directness that cost him something visible, that what he had said at the hunt had been a cowardice he had been performing for an audience who were not worth the performance. He said it plainly. He did not excuse it. She listened to the fire settle in the grate. Outside the long windows the frost lay on the pasture, and the stars were beginning to fade above the oaks. She had prepared herself to leave him, which meant she had arrived at a kind of clarity about what she needed, and that clarity held her steady now. I believed, she said when he had finished, that you were beginning to see me. He did not answer this. He looked at his hands. I am still here, she said, which was a statement of fact rather than a reassurance, and she rose and went to bed. And she left him in the library with the turned portrait and the cold grate, and the work of what he now understood. She was not surprised when he asked to speak with her the following morning, before the hunting party came down. She had risen, and dressed with her face arranged and her hands quiet, and she had gone to the little sitting room off the east corridor, and he had been there when she arrived, standing rather than sitting, which told her something. He said he wished her to remain indoors during the driven shoot, not as a request. As a proposition he was advancing for her consideration. She felt the thing close inside her chest again, quieter this time, and more final. You are protecting me, she said. Yes, he said. Or managing me, she said. He did not answer. She heard from down the servants' passage the low voice of Mrs. Holt speaking to the steward about the day's arrangements. She was not meant to hear it. She heard her own name in the housekeeper's voice, and she heard the phrase that had apparently been circulating in the lower house since October, and she heard the particular tone of a woman who was troubled by what she was reporting. The Earl's timid little wife, they were calling her. Mrs. Holt said it with a grieved precision that told Georgiana the phrase was not new and had not been corrected. She looked at Edmund. I am going to pack, she said. My father's fowling piece is in the gun room. I will collect it before I go. He did not speak immediately. She watched him, not speaking. You mean to leave, he said. I mean, she said, that I will not be managed or hidden or sheltered from the consequences of my own position. I have done nothing to be ashamed of. The hunt was your doing. The whispering was yours to end, and you have not ended it. I will not spend another autumn arranged decoratively in a room while 30 people wait for me to be invisible. She left him in the sitting room. she went to the gun room. She took her father's fowling piece from its case in the corner, and she carried it to her dressing room. And she began to wrap it carefully in the linen she used for such things, because it was her father's, and it required care. The stock was smooth under her hands, in the particular way of a well-used thing, and she wrapped it as her father had taught her to wrap it, methodically, thinking about each fold. When she had finished, she set it on the bed, and she stood looking at it. She was 24 years old, and she had been a countess for 11 months, and she had managed the household accounts and the tenants' concerns and the season's social obligations, and she had done all of it correctly and without complaint. And she had received in return a marriage that functioned as a contract, because the man inside it had not yet understood that it was also permitted to be something else. She was not bitter about this. She was clear about it. The sound of the hunting party arriving rose up through the house, boots on stone, and the dogs in the hall and voices carrying in the particular way of men who have no reason to moderate their volume. She wrapped the fowling piece and she sat on the edge of her chair with it across her knees, and she breathed very carefully, and she waited for the feeling to settle into something she could carry. She was not going to weep. She had not wept in the field a year ago, and she would not weep now. She would carry herself out of this house with the same composure she had carried herself into it, and she would be what her father had raised her to be, which was a person who did not require the world's good opinion in order to maintain her own. Edmund stood in the stone passage outside the gun room for a long time after she had gone. He stood there, in the way of a man who has run out of cowardice and is examining what is left. He thought about his father's portrait still turned to the wall. He thought about the frost, and the east pasture, and the 8 targets in a clean line, and the sound of each shot going out into the morning. He thought about what it meant to have a wife who could do what she could do, who had done nothing in 11 months but demonstrate her quality, whom he had permitted Bertram Carow and Lady Carow and the county to reduce to a phrase. He thought about his father on the deathbed, saying one true thing that Edmund had been too frightened to receive. He went down to the hall. He greeted his guests. He arranged his face in the expression the morning required of him, and he made a decision about what kind of man he was going to be before the first drive began. The autumn hunt at Wexmore Park proceeded as such mornings do. Cold, orderly, fragrant with damp leaf and gunpowder, the land laid out in the particular way of an estate that has been shot over by the same families for 3 generations. The beaters went out at 9. Lord Carow was in excellent spirits. His wife had arranged herself among the attending ladies at the edge of the first drive, with the practiced ease of a woman who has never doubted her right to take up space. Georgiana arrived late, which was noted. She wore her plain riding coat, and she carried her father's fowling piece under her arm, in its proper carrying position, and she walked to the far end of the line of waiting ladies, and she stood there. Lady Carow looked at her with an expression that began as condescension, and then sharpened into something more careful, the expression of a woman recalibrating a situation that had not gone the way she expected. The first drive went up. The men raised their guns. Edmund shot well, and Lord Carow shot well, and the morning moved through its paces with the efficiency of a ritual that knows itself by heart. The difficult bird came on the second drive. It came out of the high hedgerow to the east, at an angle that required judgment, a long crosser. The kind of shot that tests whether a man has been taught to see the line or only to raise the gun. Lord Carow was in position. He mounted his piece, and tracked, and fired and missed, which was visible to the entire field, and he lowered his gun with the expression of a man who would claim the wind. Edmund tracked the bird. He did not fire. Georgiana, standing 20 yards behind the line with the attending ladies, saw him not fire, and she understood the reason without needing to examine it. The bird was a long shot, a difficult angle, and he was not certain, and he was a man who did not like to miss in front of his guests. She raised her father's fowling piece. The movement was not dramatic. It was the movement of a woman who had been doing this since she was 12 years old, a thing so familiar it required no ceremony. She settled the gun to her shoulder, and she found the line of the bird, and she held the breath in her body for exactly the correct interval. And she released it. And she fired. The bird fell clean. The field went silent in the particular way of a group of 30 people who have simultaneously understood that something has shifted and are deciding how to receive the new fact. The beaters stood where they were. The dogs quartered. The bird was retrieved. Georgiana lowered the gun to the carry, and she looked at nothing in particular, which was the look her father had taught her to wear after a good shot. Not pride, not performance, simply the face of someone who has done a thing and is finished with it. Lord Caro said something to the man beside him. Georgiana did not hear it. She did not need to. Edmund walked across the field to where she stood. He did not hurry, and he did not perform urgency, and the field watched him cross the distance and understood the crossing, because a man's deliberate walk toward his wife in front of 30 witnesses is never a neutral act. He came to her side, and he stood with her, and he looked at the sky, where the bird had been. And then he looked at Lord Caro, who had gone still in the way of a man reassessing a position he had believed unassailable. "Lord Caro," Edmund said, in the level tone of a man not raising his voice, "my wife's shot was truer than anything I have managed this year. 11 words. Specific, public, irrevocable." He said it as a statement of observable fact, the way one reports weather, and Lord Caro received it the way one receives weather that one had not prepared for and cannot argue with. The man beside Lord Caro looked at his boots. Lady Caro, at the far edge of the ladies' group, brought her fan to her chin and held it there and said nothing, which was, for Lady Caro, a very loud kind of nothing. The shift in the field was not dramatic. And shifts of this kind rarely are. They happen in the particular quality of the silence that follows a statement no one can contradict, and in the slight realignment of posture among the witnesses, and in the moment when 2 or 3 people look at each other and understand without speaking that the hierarchy they had been operating inside has quietly revised itself. The field resumed. It resumed because hunts resume, because October mornings are not interrupted for long by the kind of reckoning that changes private things, and the second drive went up and the third in the morning moved through to its close. A gentleman who had stood near the ladies came to Georgiana and said, with some care, that it was a fine shot for the angle. He said it with the particular respect of someone who understands what the angle required and is offering a genuine judgment rather than a social courtesy. She thanked him simply, and he went back to his position, and the morning went on. Something had shifted in the air of the field, the way a room shifts after a window has been opened, and Georgiana felt it in the particular silence that had replaced the phrase she had been living inside for 11 months. The Earl's timid little wife. The phrase had nowhere to land anymore. She had taken the ground it required. That evening, after the hunting party had dined, and the carriages had begun to go, and the long autumn dark had settled over the park, Georgiana went to the library. She had not planned to go. She went because the library was the room in the house where things that were true became apparent, and she had something true to do. The portrait of Helena, Countess of Wexmore, still faced the wall above the chimney-piece. Georgiana stood before it for a moment. She had thought about it often in the past months, this portrait she had never seen, this woman who had been married in this house and loved in this house and mourned in this house and then carefully, systematically erased from it. She reached up and turned it. The woman in the portrait was 30 or 35, dark-haired, with Edmund's eyes in a softer face, and she was looking out at the room with an expression of composed and absolute certainty that Georgiana recognized as the expression of a woman who knows her own worth, and has stopped apologizing for knowing it. The paint was old and the color warm. She looked as though she had been waiting to face the room again for a very long time. Georgiana heard Edmund in the doorway. She did not turn. She looked at the portrait, and she heard him come into the room, and she heard the sound of his breathing behind her. She should face the room, Georgiana said. She has been turned to the wall long enough. He stood very close to her. Not touching. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the room's chill. Close enough that her breathing altered, and she noted that it altered without trying to correct it. The fire had begun to catch in the grate. The long windows held the dark outside and reflected the fire's light, and the two of them standing before the portrait. "Yes," he said. The word was not an answer to what she had said about the portrait. He put his hand then against the back of hers. Well, not taking it, not gripping it, simply his hand resting against the back of hers in the quiet way of a man who has decided to stop performing a coldness he does not feel and is beginning the long work of demonstrating something else. Her pulse was audible in her throat. She let it be. She thought of the east pasture in the frost, the line of targets, the sound of each shot going out into the morning. She thought of her father, who had taught her that good aim requires the willingness to see what is actually there, not what you expect or hope to find. She thought of 11 months of arranging her face carefully in rooms that were not yet home. She turned her hand under his. She let their fingers rest together, lightly. A beginning rather than an arrival, the kind of contact that requires no ceremony and no declaration because what it says is legible without either. They stood before the portrait for a long time with the fire catching in the grate and the evening settling outside the long windows, and Georgiana felt the library arrange itself slowly around her into the shape of a room that might, one day, with patience and continued honest effort, become hers. "I was not going to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "You have not given me reason enough to stay," she said. "No," he said. "Not yet." The fire settled. The dark pressed against the windows. She felt his thumb move once, barely perceptibly against the back of her hand, and she thought of the portrait facing the room again, after years in the dark, and she thought that some things could be turned back. "Then give me reason," she said. The whispering did not stop entirely. That autumn, whispers in the county rarely stop entirely. They require years to die, and a steady supply of contrary evidence, and the willingness of the people inside the story to keep living it without apology. Lady Cara was observed, at the first dinner of the winter season, to speak of the Countess of Wexmore in terms that were, if not warm, at least accurate. Lord Caro shot with the Wexmore party twice more before Christmas, and said nothing during either visit that could be recorded as a reduction. The gentleman who had come to Georgiana on the field repeated the story of her shot at 3 separate dinner tables before the season was out, and he improved the angle each time, which she thought her father would have found quietly amusing. Mrs. Holt reported to no one, which was the particular eloquence of a housekeeper who has watched a household change and approved of the change. She set the library's tea tray each morning with 2 cups from the start of November. She did not remark upon this. In December, when the first hard frost came and the east pasture lay white and still in the early morning, Edmund rose before dawn, without ceremony, and came downstairs to find Georgiana already in the gun-room in her plain coat, her father's fowling piece in her hands. She looked up when he came in. He looked at the gun, and then at her. She moved without speaking, to take the second of the matched Mantons from its rack and hand it to him, and he took it in the level way of a man who has accepted an invitation he should have accepted sooner, and they went out together through the kitchen garden and across the ha-ha and into the frost. They did not speak much. They had never been people who required a great deal of speech, which she had once read as coldness in him and was beginning to understand as something else, a quality of attention that expressed itself in action rather than declaration. He watched how she set the targets. He adjusted his own stance once, without being asked, after watching her. She did not comment on this. She reset the line, and they worked through the morning together, and the sound of their shots went out into the frost, in turn, 2 voices in the same quiet language. She thought, crossing back over the ha-ha in the early light, that this was perhaps how things were built between people who were not naturally confiding. Not through declaration, not through the large ceremonial moments, though those had their place, but through the accumulated small evidence of being present. Through the adjusted stance, and the reset line, and the soundless crossing of a cold pasture before the household was awake. She was not sentimental about it. She was clear-eyed about the distance still to be covered and the habits still to be altered, and the particular kind of trust that takes more than a single autumn to construct. She was also clear-eyed about the fact that he had crossed the field in front of 30 witnesses. And she had taken the difficult bird, and the whispering had lost its purchase, and these were not nothing. They were, in fact, a great deal. Her father's fowling piece was cleaned that evening and hung above the library's chimney-piece, beneath the portrait of the woman with Edmund's eyes. Where it remained, it was seen by every guest who came to Wexmore that winter. No one who saw it required an explanation of what it meant. It hung there, in the firelight, plain and worn and precisely what it was. The kind of thing that tells its story without requiring any assistance. Below it, the portrait of Helena Vane faced the room she had always deserved to face, her expression of composed certainty unchanged by the years it had spent against the wall. The east pasture was quiet in the mornings. They kept it quiet together. They kept it